hustle and bustle of Plymouth's George Street in the latter part of the turbulent 1930s. Behind the facade, preparations anticipated conflict in Europe. The old frangible BBC City base was to be requisitioned by civil defence. A new broadcasting base was on the horizon. 2 properties were on the shortlist. After some financial negotiation, Ingledene, a detached property in a quiet backwater, was chosen. This was to be a studio base and, importantly, a control hub for the new transmitter at Start Point. Within months, the upheaval of war was to change Plymouth forever. It was a good day. Warm spring sunshine and the presence of royalty made the war seem remote and even unreal. There was also a little unease. Some said that where royalty went, the Luftwaffe was never far behind, and this time they were right, though for the wrong reasons. 150 Nazi pilots were already in the air as the royal visit ended. The maps they consulted and the aerial photographs were of Plymouth. It was 6 months since the RAF raids on Berlin, 4 months since the sledgehammer reprisal on Coventry. Now it was Plymouth's turn to be Coventrated. In this remarkable film, which was made for propaganda purposes, the actual preparation of aircraft, crews, and the journey for the raid on Devon on March the 21st, 1941, was recorded as a lesson for history.
Instalando a câmara. Cumprindo corajosamente o seu dever, o operador acompanha os companheiros da Força Aérea nos seus voos contra o inimigo. Imagens focadas por ele durante o bombardeamento do porto de Plymouth.
There had been nothing like this before. First had come the fighters to shoot down the barrage balloons, then the pathfinders, dropping flares to pinpoint their targets, then the bombers, scattering thousands of incendiary bombs, then the bombers again, this time in waves, dropping high explosives into the flames. They've taken their time about it. The bombing lasted 4 hours, and in the narrow streets of the old city they'd achieved maximum damage with minimum effort. The fires had spread uncontrollably from building to building. It was systematic destruction, clinical, indiscriminate. Plymouth stumbled from its air raid shelters to find large parts of the city in ruins. Shattered too was the complacent belief that it couldn't happen here. Firemen, police wardens and civil defence workers who had gone without sleep all night spent the rest of the daylight hours clearing rubble and looking for bodies. Then the fighters, the pathfinders and the bombers came back again for another 4 hours. The rest of the city centre had gone. This picture shows the remains of the old BBC studio site. Athenaeum Arcade was a broken shell. In 2 nights, in 8 hours of bombing, 20,000 properties had gone up in flames. 336 civilians, and nobody knows how many servicemen died. Suddenly, "we can take it" wasn't such a popular catchphrase. Thousands decided they'd already taken enough. At dusk, they trekked out of the city for the frosty sanctuary of Dartmoor. They slept in tents or caravans, if they were lucky, under the stars if they weren't. The day-to-day life of the city had been disrupted. Emergency services had been shown up as hopelessly inadequate. Morale was slipping. Stunned by bombardment and weary from lack of sleep, Plymouthians began to recall with some bitterness that their city had been declared a safe zone, but no plans had been made to evacuate their children. That a handful of obsolete biplanes had given them no real protection. The flames of resentment were fanned by new realisations. The uselessness of brick-built shelters above the ground, the tragic stupidity that sent scores of fire brigades hundreds of miles to fight the fires in Plymouth, only to find that their hoses didn't fit the city's fire hydrants. The realisation that, because of this, fires raging out of control were causing 3 times as much damage as the bombs, and that homes were burning to the ground while firemen could do nothing. An awareness too that all these lessons had been learned months before in Coventry and London, but not in Plymouth. But then a week went by with only false alarms. Shivering in their shelters, the people of Plymouth heard the bombers fly on to other targets. March turned to April. Only one small raid disturbed the city's recovering equilibrium. The voice of Lord Haw-Haw spouting Nazi propaganda warned that Devonport's turn would come soon. But people were sleeping in their beds again. Morale was picking up. The aerial onslaught recommenced on April the 21st. This time Devonport was included to light the fire that was seen from Exeter to Bodmin and to drop thousands of tons of high explosive into the flames. At 12 p.m. on the night of April the 22nd, one bomb caused Plymouth's most infamous tragedy. It fell in a pleasant tree-lined square of terraced houses overlooking a small park. Under the park was a large communal air raid shelter. The bomb hit the steps of the shelter and exploded amongst the people as it ricocheted inside. Although now built upon and part of the university campus, many older residents and writers still talk about the Portland Square bomb, ferocious enough to deposit human remains in the surrounding trees. At least 76 civilians were killed, and in some cases entire families wiped out. Only 3 children survived. The onslaught continued. Over the 5 nights of April attacks, it was calculated that collectively they covered nearly 24 hours of continuous bombardment. By then, Plymouth had earned the grim title of Britain's most damaged city. Size for size, more high explosive bombs had been dumped on it than any other town, but it was fire that had been the worst enemy. Fire and complacency. The price was extortionate. 926 civilians were killed. 3,269 were injured. 30,000 were homeless. 3,700 houses were destroyed and 70,000 damaged. Every public building had been destroyed, along with 40 churches, 24 schools, 100 pubs, 8 cinemas, a theatre, 7 hotels and 12 clubs. The city had lost a third of its rateable value, and before long a third of its residents. The War Cabinet was told that Plymouth morale had been broken. Next month, they evacuated the children and laid water lanes in the street for firefighting and static water tanks, and reorganised the nation's fire brigades into one better equipped national fire service.
Here comes Winston.
That same month, Winston Churchill arrived, promising vengeance. Some ran after his car shouting, "Give it 'em back, Winnie," but not many. Plymouth had discovered all it wanted to know about reprisals. Plymouth had many more raids before the war ended. The sirens were to wail over the city's ruins 300 times yet. Over 1,000 people lost their lives during these tragic years, many buried in communal graves. But the raids were over by April 1944. The locals watched the build-up of boats and materials for the Second Front, still nervous that the aerial assailants may return. There was no regional radio journalism to report and review the extraordinary events that befell the Janners, but in London the BBC sought to boost morale wherever possible. Listen to an excerpt from The Stones' Cry Out.
I am the city of Plymouth. In the spring of this year, the German Air Force did what it could to wipe me out. Bomb after bomb and fire after fire, they turned my streets to a labyrinth of ruins, and they killed many of my children. But they did not kill my spirit. They did not wipe me out. I remain the city of Plymouth. Among all the cities of England, I have been born and bred to the sea, and I breed my sons to the sea. I have sent them out to explore the world, to look for a northwest passage or an El Dorado. I have sent them out to fight the foes of England. Some went out and never came back. But others will follow, whatever the danger, whatever the seeming impossible odds. Others will follow, out from my harbours to the 7 seas, to the end of the world and the end of time. Others will follow. Be sure of that.
What are you thinking about, Miss Davis? I asked you a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Inspector. I was daydreaming. Don't you ever do that? Listen to a voice in your head?
Oh, maybe, if I had the time. I must get this report finished on the evacuated school kids. These Plymouth children seem to be doing well out here.
Better than we expected, considering what they've come from. You wouldn't think to look at them they'd lived through that inferno. Though one or two of them, just at times, get a kind of look in their eyes.
Yes, of course they do. The raids on Plymouth were about the worst there have been. But what I want you to tell me are the following points.
They turned my streets to a labyrinth of ruins, and they killed many of my children. But they did not kill my spirit. They did not wipe me out. I remain the city of Plymouth, a queen among ports and a mother of heroes. And my fighting ships go out from under Plymouth Hoe on dangerous errands into the darkness. Some may not come back, but others will take their place. Others will take their place. Be sure of that.
Back at Ingledene, the local broadcasting house provided a mouthpiece for local musicians, facilities for drama, talks, and returning war correspondents. Police and Home Guard secured the site 24 hours a day. Armoral Rosevear had joined BBC Plymouth as the administrator and had a reputation for strictness.
We used to take in turns to a fire watch at night. We had bedrooms there. We had barbed wire around the garden and Home Guard on duty at night. And the engineers were the chief people, and we weren't allowed to have regional broadcasting because they said that was direction finding. So we had to contribute to the basic home service.
The BBC sought an engineering solution for this radio beacon challenge, as Harold Bishop, the BBC wartime engineering chief, explained in a radio programme made in 1960. We also learn about the vital role Start Point made in wartime communication with Europe.
It is possible for an aircraft to pick up, to receive the transmissions from a high-power broadcasting station at distances of perhaps 300, 400 miles even, and by special apparatus to direct his course towards that station or to any other specified direction. Now, to avoid that being possible, we arranged that our station should work in groups on the same wavelength. And if you do that, then it is impossible to use any one of the stations in the group for navigational purposes until the aircraft gets within perhaps, say, 50 miles of the station.
Now, since Start Point was then working on a wavelength all on its own, the group system couldn't be applied. And so another method had to be used to stop the enemy treating Start Point rather like a radio lighthouse.
We wanted to try out a scheme we had of a special sort of aerial system, and we had considerable success with that arrangement. And we used the station with this special form of aerial without it giving navigational aid. But unfortunately, its range was restricted, and it had certain other disadvantages which caused it not to be used for the home service. But we did use it for our European service, and it was possible to receive it quite satisfactorily in northern France and areas like that.
This special aerial was a great network of wire strung between the two masts. In January of the first winter of war, the engineers at Start had another enemy to battle with, the weather. On the staff at that time was Bob Wright.
It rained, and immediately afterwards there was a hard frost, and everything became covered in ice. Ice on the telephone wires 2 or 3 inches in diameter, and the bushes were all covered in ice, tinkling almost in the wind. I've never seen a storm like it before, and of course the weight was doubled and trebled and just crashed to earth.
After an all-day struggle in biting wind, transmissions were resumed that same evening on a new aerial system. Oddly enough, this was the worst attack of any kind suffered by the station throughout the war, though they were prepared for almost anything. The place was surrounded by barbed wire, and the windows were sandbagged. There was a small garrison with a few machine guns. And they had guard dogs too, strong-jawed Alsatians.
One occasion I remember one of our number had to go out during the night to change over one of the shortwave aerials, and we had 15 minutes in which to perform this, and it usually took about 5. At the end of about 10 he hadn't returned. I got a bit worried and sent somebody else out to look for him, and they came back and said that Harry, it wasn't actually his name, Harry was up the pole. So I said, well, we knew that, but why make a point of it at this time in the morning? And he said, no, he's actually up the pole. And it turned out that he had been spotted by the guard dog in a somewhat vulnerable position and had just shot up the nearest pole, and having got up there found that he couldn't get down again. And finally we had to produce a ladder to get him down, and we just managed to get back on the air in time.
And what was actually going out over the air at this time? Encouragement to a defeated Europe. Messages of hope to occupied France. One of those engaged in producing these broadcasts was Jacques Grunius.
Ah, you were on these French programs. Do you remember these little songs you used to sing during the war? If I remember. I even remember the day we came across the idea. It was during the summer of 1940. Since the 14th of July, we were concocting a program in French every night. It was not yet Les Français parlent au français. We only announced Ici Londres. We were a team of 5. 2 of us came from the theater. There was a painter, a cartoonist, only 1 journalist, and myself who used to make films. None of us had ever worked for radio, but the French radio before the war was so poor that we thought our inexperience could only be an asset. Yet we were rather embarrassed about program content. We felt we could not talk all the time and that we should use music. But music for music's sake would have been rather frivolous in the circumstances. And then, suddenly, we remembered the only thing we used to enjoy on radio before the war, the commercials from Radio Luxembourg or Radio Normandy. They always included a slogan in the form of a short advertising ditty set to a well-known popular tune. Why not imitate them? For instance, there was one for some quinquina tonic sung on the tune of the cucaracha, and we found at once that we could sing something useful on the same tune.
Radio Paris ment, Radio Paris ment, Radio Paris est allemand. Radio Paris ment, Radio Paris ment, Radio Paris est allemand.
Paris Radio is lying, Paris Radio is German.
Les chansons que vous avez entendues à la radio vous sont apportées par vos amis de la RAF. Chansons de la BBC.
The radio broadcasts from Start Point were a formidable soft weapon against Nazi propaganda. The RAF bolstered this effort by airdropping little booklets containing musical ditties satirizing the Nazi machine.
At certain hours, the transmitter would appear to relapse into gibberish. The announcer would say in French, "Aunt Yvonne's kettle will boil tomorrow. Aunt Yvonne's kettle will boil tomorrow." To most people, the Germans included, these words meant nothing. But to some resistance workers in West Brittany, the message meant life or death. Men such as Dr. Vush, a country doctor living outside the port of Brest, where the German battle cruisers were waiting to dash up channel.
The radio transmitter at Start Point was well known to us in the resistance organization in West Brittany during the war. From this station, we received the message which told us that we must expect a landing on our coast of perhaps an agent or a new radio for sending an intelligence report back to England.
And yet, all the time, Start Point was never attacked by German aircraft. From 1942 onwards, G.C. Meikle was engineer in charge.
Several times a week, especially latterly, we had the nuisance raids. Focke-Wulfs used to come over, usually in half dozen covers or lots, you know, and fly in low over the sea to escape the radar detection, up over the Start Point cliffs, quite near the station, and do their bombing, round about nuisance bombing, of course, farmhouses, villages, anywhere to create the nuisance atmosphere.
It's puzzling why their planes never turned their attention towards so obvious a target. Mr. Meikle has a possible solution.
I myself think that the Germans took the mast as a guide. You see, The Jerry planes were based on Cherbourg, and they could see the mast a short time after taking off. In fact, from the top of the Start Point mast, you can actually see the French coast on a clear day. So I think probably what happened that they left on their nuisance raids, you see, and flying low over the sea, took the Start Point mast as a guide and followed that route until they were very close in to the shore. Then up they'd come over the cliffs and away to bomb whatever the target they had in mind. Then, of course, there's always the possibility that they listened into Start Point, and being on this wartime service, it was more use to them alive than dead.
So the transmissions continued with few interruptions. A number of these were caused by barrage balloons, which had broken loose from their moorings. Their trailing cables used to short the local power lines. Life at the station was a continuous routine of transmissions and inspections, lightened during off-duty hours by the pleasant surroundings.
We had a resident ferret, which we used for mostly in the lunch hour. We'd go out and work round the hedges of the site and catch quite a number of rabbits, which came in very useful in those days, of course, when meat was fairly scarce.
We used to get pretty well all the fish and crabs and whatnot that we wanted from the nearby lighthouse. We had a sort of trading agreement. The lighthouse people were fond of pheasants, and we had a superfluity of pheasants, and we were fond of crabs. So we had a sort of exchange and mart with them that, there you are, there's a pheasant, now what about a nice crab?
I used to go out each day during the summer. During that time, saw the first death's head hawk moth I'd ever seen. And that same year we had the 2 locusts, and the lighthouse also caught one. One locust went right through the machine room from one doorway to the other doorway and out the other side. And the other one we captured on the cliff. We didn't catch the first one, but we had to send those to the British Museum for identification, and the lighthouse sent theirs and I sent mine, and they were actually locusts.
That was Miss Edwards, secretary to the engineer in charge. She wasn't the only woman on the station. There were female transmitter engineers too during the war. New staff arrived and settled down in neighbouring towns and villages. The Americans came and turned the South Hams into a battle school, and then they went. And then, one day, the channel was full of ships, all heading for Normandy.
It was rather far out to see exactly what they were, but all day long there seemed to be groups of vessels passing up the channel, and we used to dash up to the roof about every half hour or so to see if we could see another group going up. A little disorganised the work, I fear.
Back in the leafy suburb, Shirley Kenny had joined the BBC on the Technical Assistant Recruitment Scheme, here recording the war correspondence and the lead up to D-Day.
We were told that when the invasion started, instead of getting just a straight 1,000-cycle tone on the incoming lines, which we had to test, and that's what they used for testing them, we would get an interrupted tone, which was sort of beep, 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 like that. And when that happened, we knew the invasion had started.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
After that, we had all sorts of war correspondents and, you know, coming back from the beaches, came in here to send their stuff up the line to London. The only one whose name I can remember is Stanley Maxted. And I can remember him coming in looking, really sort of, really whacked, you know, a bit like a drowned rat. I think it had been raining or he'd been in the water or something.
This is Stanley Maxted speaking from a British port on the morning of June the 11th. I've just stepped off one of the motor torpedo boats of the light coastal forces, which last night bored in north of Cherbourg and engaged enemy E-boats attempting to filter through to the beachhead anchorage. At the briefing yesterday
On a slightly lighter note, Frank Gillard, war correspondent and future leader in the BBC West region, recalled an awkward moment during his wartime service when in conversation with BBC Plymouth presenter Chris Denham.
There were lighter moments in war reporting. I'm thinking of one particular occasion at the bottom of Plymouth Sound.
Yes, this was in the earlier years of the war, when I was working with the forces who were in training for whatever invasions and future operations were going to take place. And down in Plymouth, I discovered there was a port construction company of the Royal Engineers who were working on the seabed and training themselves to cope with any obstructions that the Germans might put in the harbours and ports of France once we landed over there. And I thought it would be fun to go down onto the seabed and see what they were doing, walking about on the seabed of Plymouth Sound. It seemed very attractive indeed. And so they said, yes, they'd rig me up in a diver's suit and I could go down. But they said, no doubt about it, you'll come arse first up to the surface again. They put on this diver's suit. They put a microphone inside the diver's helmet. They ran the wire from the microphone down my arm and out of my sleeve here, and they bound it up very tightly, hoping that would be watertight, and tossed me into the water, and down I went, and walked about in the murky depth of Plymouth Sound on the seabed. And all went well, and I was able to do a nice little commentary for the first minute or two, but then water pressure, which was quite considerable at that depth, began to burst through my sleeve here, where the wire came out. And before I knew what it was, I had a great spurt of water coming into my diving suit, shooting right up my arm and filling the suit. And I thought, my God, I'm going to be drowned here inside a diving suit on the seabed of Plymouth Sound. So I yelled into the microphone, haul me up, haul me up. And I'm glad to say I came up head first, not arse first, but I did come up pretty quickly, and I was absolutely soaked because the whole thing was full of water, you see. By the time I got to the surface, it was almost up to my chin. And every scrap of clothing I had on, of course, was saturated. And I hadn't a dry suit anywhere nearer than Bristol that day. And so I drove to Broadcasting House in Plymouth, saturated, soaking wet, and stripped off everything I'd got, and it was all put in the boiler room. And there was a bed for a night watchman in one of the studios at BBC Plymouth, and I climbed into this bed and stayed in bed until my clothes was dry enough to wear again.
Plymouth launched into a mammoth rebuilding project before the end of the war. A provocative feature film documentary, written and directed by Jill Craigie, The Way We Live, sought to tease out the design and social challenges of architecture and captured the political polemic. Plymouth's rebuilding, whilst initially successful, has, in the view of many, failed to deliver the opportunities which nature has bestowed on the city. There is no doubt that broadcasting in the war had boosted the BBC's reputation both at home and abroad, but that was not enough to sustain its standing in the following decades. With changing ideology and technology, every decade dictated reinvention and change.